At 46 years old, Ethan Walker thought his life had officially hit bottom. 6 months earlier, he had lost the job he'd held for nearly 2 decades. His savings were disappearing faster than he wanted to admit. The consulting work he'd hoped would keep him afloat had dried up completely. Most mornings he sat alone at a kitchen table covered in unpaid bills, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he received a phone call that made absolutely no sense. A lawyer informed him that a distant uncle he barely remembered had passed away and left him an inheritance. Ethan expected a few $100s, maybe an old pickup truck. Instead, he inherited a forgotten rural airstrip in the middle of Montana. The property looked worthless. The runway was cracked. The office was falling apart. Weeds grew through the pavement, and according to the locals, nobody had made a serious attempt to operate the place in decades. Most people told him to sell it immediately and walk away. But while clearing out years of debris, Ethan discovered something that changed everything. At the far edge of the property stood an old hangar with rusted doors welded shut from the outside. No one had opened it since 1974. Not the county, not the previous owner, not even the mechanics who once worked there. And when Ethan finally learned why that hangar had been sealed for more than 50 years, he uncovered a mystery that would rewrite a forgotten chapter of local history and change his own life forever. But before we step onto that abandoned airstrip and unlock the door that nobody had touched since 1974, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What city, state, or country are you in right now? And what time is it where you are? Leave a comment below and say hello. I read as many comments as I can, and it's always fascinating to see how many different places these stories reach. Wherever you're listening from, I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening. If you enjoy stories about hidden mysteries, forgotten places, second chances, and ordinary people who stumble into extraordinary discoveries, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And if you ever notice a detail that could be improved, feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Now, let's go back to the day Ethan Walker drove across Montana to claim an inheritance that nobody else wanted. Ethan Walker stared at the email for nearly a full minute before closing the laptop. Then he opened it again and read the message a second time. Nothing had changed. The consulting company that had promised to make a decision by Friday had chosen someone else. The project was gone, just like the 3 opportunities before it. He leaned back in the kitchen chair and rubbed his eyes. Outside the apartment window, a cold March rain tapped against the glass. Inside, the silence felt heavier than the weather. A stack of envelopes sat unopened on the corner of the table. Electric bill, credit card statement, rent notice. Ethan already knew what each one contained. Numbers he couldn't ignore and couldn't comfortably pay. 6 months earlier, he had still believed the layoff was temporary. 21 years working in logistics had to count for something. People with his experience always found another position. At least, that was what he told himself during the first few weeks. Then the weeks became months. Interviews came and went. Promising conversations ended with polite emails. Savings disappeared one withdrawal at a time. The confidence he'd spent decades building vanished even faster. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down. His daughter, Emma. He answered immediately. "Hey." "Hi, Dad." Her voice always lifted his mood, even when she was calling from 3 states away. "How are you?" she asked. Ethan looked around the apartment. Dishes in the sink, job applications scattered across the counter. A refrigerator that contained little more than leftovers and optimism. "I'm doing okay." Emma laughed softly. That's not what I asked. Ethan smiled despite himself. She had inherited her mother's ability to spot a lie before it fully formed. It's been a rough week. Any news? Not the kind I wanted. There was a brief pause. You'll find something. He appreciated that she still believed it. Some days he wasn't sure he did. They talked for a few minutes about her classes and an upcoming exam before ending the call. Afterward, Ethan sat quietly in the fading afternoon light. The apartment felt smaller than it used to. 2 years ago, after the divorce, he had told himself downsizing was practical, temporary. Another transition. Now it felt like evidence, a record of everything that had slowly fallen apart. His thoughts were interrupted by another phone call. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Instead, he answered. Ethan Walker. Mr. Walker. The woman on the other end sounded professional. My name is Linda Barrett. I'm an attorney calling from Billings, Montana. Ethan frowned. I think you have the wrong number. You are Ethan James Walker. Yes. Then I believe I have the correct number. Ethan sat up slightly. Okay. I'm calling regarding the estate of Walter Reed. The name meant almost nothing to him. Somewhere deep in his memory, he vaguely recalled meeting an older relative at a family gathering when he was a child. Maybe. He wasn't even certain. I'm sorry, Ethan said. Who? Walter Reed, your mother's uncle. Ethan stared at the rain outside. I haven't heard that name in decades. That's understandable. She paused. Mr. Reed passed away 3 weeks ago. Ethan felt a brief, unexpected sadness, not because he knew the man, but because another piece of family history had quietly disappeared. I'm sorry to hear that. Mr. Reed left specific instructions regarding his estate. Ethan expected the conversation to end there, perhaps a request for information, maybe genealogy paperwork. Instead, she continued, You are the sole beneficiary. Ethan laughed once, not because it was funny, because it seemed impossible. There has to be a mistake. There is no mistake. Why me? I honestly couldn't answer that. Ethan leaned forward. What exactly did he leave? Papers shuffled on the other end. A property located outside Red Creek, Montana. A house? Not exactly. Another pause followed. It's a private airstrip. Ethan blinked. A what? A rural airstrip and associated land holdings. For several seconds, he simply stared at the wall. He had expected many things. An airstrip was not one of them. You're serious? Very. I don't know anything about airstrips. Neither did Mr. Reed when he inherited it. The attorney almost sounded amused. Ethan shook his head. None of this made sense. How large is this place? Approximately 120 acres. Ethan nearly dropped the phone. 120 acres. He couldn't even afford new tires for his car. There must be debts attached. Some. How much? Property taxes are overdue. Of course they were. Nothing in his life arrived without complications anymore. The attorney gave him several details and arranged a meeting for the following week, after the call ended. Ethan remained motionless at the kitchen table. The apartment suddenly felt different. Not better, just stranger. An airstrip in Montana, left to him by a relative he barely remembered. That night he searched online until nearly midnight. The results were limited. A few old references, a location marker, several aerial photographs. The runway looked abandoned. Cracked pavement cut through a field of brown grass. A handful of aging buildings stood nearby. One image showed what appeared to be several hangars near the far end of the property. Most looked neglected. One seemed oddly isolated from the others. Ethan studied the photograph for a long time before finally shutting the laptop. 5 days later, after a 2-day drive across endless stretches of highway, he turned onto a gravel road outside Red Creek. The Montana sky seemed impossibly large. Mountains rested in the distance. Wind swept across open fields. His aging SUV rattled over potholes as he followed directions from the attorney. Then he saw it. The runway appeared first. Long, empty, weathered by decades of neglect. Beyond it sat a cluster of buildings and hangars surrounded by rusting fences and tall weeds. Ethan pulled to the side of the road and switched off the engine. The airstrip stretched silently before him. It looked forgotten, abandoned, almost like time had stopped there years ago. Then his eyes settled on a weather-beaten sign hanging crookedly near the entrance gate. Most of the lettering had faded away, but one line remained barely readable. Hangar 3. No entry. Authorized since October 1974. Ethan spent his first night in Red Creek at a roadside motel that looked only slightly newer than the airstrip. Sleep came in short stretches. Every time he woke up, he found himself staring at the ceiling and thinking about the faded sign near the entrance gate. Hangar 3. No entry authorized since October 1974. It sounded less like a warning and more like the beginning of a story nobody had bothered to finish. By 8 o'clock the next morning, he was standing inside the office of Linda Barrett, the attorney handling Walter Reed's estate. The office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking Main Street. Linda greeted him with a firm handshake and a stack of paperwork. "Long drive?" she asked. "Long enough." Ethan sat down. "I still don't understand why Walter left all of this to me." Linda gave him a sympathetic smile. "Neither do I, but his instructions were very clear." She opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. Walter's will contained only a few pages. Most of it was standard legal language. One section, however, had been highlighted. Ethan read it twice. "The property shall remain intact until transferred to Ethan Walker. No structures are to be demolished prior to transfer. No sealed buildings are to be opened." Ethan looked up. Sealed buildings. Linda nodded. Those were his exact words. Did he ever explain why? Never. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Another question with no answer. The rest of the morning disappeared into signatures, tax documents, property records, and liability forms. By noon, he officially owned 120 acres of abandoned Montana real estate. It felt absurd. Outside, the wind had picked up. Ethan drove back to the airstrip carrying a folder full of paperwork and very little understanding of what he'd inherited. The gate groaned when he pushed it open. Tall grass brushed against his jeans as he walked toward the main office building. The structure looked tired. Peeling paint curled from the walls. Several windows were boarded up. The roof sagged in one corner. Inside, dust covered everything. Old filing cabinets lined one wall. A cracked coffee mug sat on a desk as if someone had stepped away and never returned. Ethan spent the next hour opening drawers and sorting through decades of forgotten paperwork. Most of it was useless. Fuel receipts, maintenance invoices, insurance forms. Yet scattered among the records were signs that the place had once mattered. A photograph showed several small planes parked beside the runway. Another featured a group of smiling mechanics standing in front of a hangar. There had been life here once. Ambition, activity. Somewhere along the way, it had all stopped. Around mid-afternoon, he heard an engine outside. Through the window, he saw an old pickup truck pulling onto the property. A thin man climbed out slowly. He looked to be in his 70s. His gray beard moved in the wind. Ethan stepped outside to meet him. "Can I help you?" The man studied him for a moment. "You Walter's nephew?" "I guess I am." The man nodded. "Name's Hank Morrison." He extended a weathered hand. "Worked here when I was a kid." Ethan shook it. "You knew Walter?" "Long time." Hank glanced toward the runway. Didn't talk much. Worked harder than anybody. They walked together across the property. Hank pointed out structures and explained what they had once been used for: fuel storage, maintenance shop, radio room. Listening to him was like hearing the ghost of the airstrip speak. "What happened here?" Ethan finally asked. Hank shrugged. "Bit by bit. Things dried up. Traffic moved elsewhere. Costs went up." He paused. "Then there was everything else." Ethan caught the hesitation. "What does that mean?" Hank looked away. "Old story." Ethan let it go for the moment. They continued walking until they reached the row of hangars. The first two stood open, empty except for scattered equipment and rusting shelves. Then they reached the third building. Hangar 3 sat slightly apart from the others. The steel doors were closed. Rust stained the metal. Chains wrapped around the handles. What caught Ethan's attention wasn't the lock. It was the welds. Thick metal seams ran along the edges of both doors. Someone had deliberately sealed the building shut. Hank stopped walking. "There she is." Ethan stared at the hangar. "What happened in there?" Hank folded his arms. "Depends on who you ask." "What do you mean?" "Some people said it stored old aircraft parts." "And the others?" Hank was quiet for several seconds. "Some people said Walter never wanted anyone inside after '74. Ethan stepped closer. The welds looked old but solid. Rain and time had darkened them. "Do you have a key?" Hank laughed softly. "Key won't help much." Ethan touched the cold metal. "Who sealed it?" "Walter hired a welder from town." "Why?" "Never said." The answer only deepened the mystery. They circled the building. Most of the windows had been covered from the inside. Weeds grew along the foundation. It looked less like a storage building and more like a tomb. Before leaving, Hank paused beside his truck. "If you're thinking about opening that hangar, don't expect answers to come easy." "You know something?" Hank shook his head. "Not enough." He climbed into the truck. Then, just before closing the door, he added one final comment. "Funny thing is, nobody's ever found a key for it." Ethan frowned. "Nobody? Not Walter, not the county, not anybody." Hank started the engine. "As far as I know, the keys disappeared 50 years ago." Ethan stood alone beside the sealed hangar as the truck drove away. The wind rattled loose sheet metal somewhere across the property. He looked again at the welded doors. No keys, no explanation, and a building nobody had entered since 1974. For the first time since arriving in Montana, he wasn't thinking about unemployment, overdue bills, or the mess his life had become. He was thinking about one question: what was important enough to lock away for half a century? Ethan spent the next 2 days doing something he hadn't expected when he arrived in Montana: physical labor. The airstrip looked abandoned from a distance, but up close, it was worse. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement. Fallen branches littered the property. Several sections of fencing had collapsed. By late afternoon on the second day, His shoulders ached and his hands were blistered.
Yet for the first time in months, he found himself ending a day tired for a reason he could understand. There was something satisfying about seeing progress, even if it came one wheelbarrow at a time. That morning, he had also made an unpleasant discovery. Property taxes on the airstrip were more overdue than he originally thought. The amount wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't small either. If he couldn't find a plan soon, selling the land might become his only option. The thought bothered him more than it should have. He couldn't explain why. Maybe because everything else in his life had already been sold, lost, or left behind. Around noon, a dusty SUV pulled onto the property. A woman stepped out carrying a camera bag and a notebook. She looked to be in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Ethan assumed she had taken a wrong turn. Instead, she walked directly toward him. "You must be Ethan Walker." He set down a rake. "Depends who's asking." The woman smiled. "Claire Morgan. I run the Red Creek Gazette." "The newspaper?" "One of the last surviving local newspapers in America, according to me." Ethan laughed despite himself. "What brings you here?" Claire glanced toward the runway. "Small town. New owner shows up at a famous abandoned airstrip. That's front-page material around here." Ethan looked around at the empty property. "Famous? You'd be surprised." She opened her notebook. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" What Ethan expected to be a quick interview stretched into nearly an hour. Claire asked about his background, the inheritance, and his plans for the property. Unlike most people, she seemed genuinely interested in the airstrip's history. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward Hangar 3. "Everyone keeps mentioning that building," Ethan said. Claire looked toward the far end of the property, because nobody knows the full story. "You have a theory?" "Several," she smiled. "That's what journalists do." Before leaving, she made an unexpected offer. "I have access to newspaper archives going back decades. If you're curious about the airstrip, I can help dig around." Ethan hesitated. A week ago, he would have politely declined. Now he found himself saying, "I'd appreciate that." After she left, he returned to work with a new sense of purpose. By late afternoon, he stood in front of Hangar 3 again. The welded doors looked even more mysterious now. He remembered the wording in Walter's will. No sealed buildings are to be opened prior to transfer. Transfer had happened, legally. The property belonged to him. The restriction no longer applied. The question wasn't whether he could open the hangar. The question was whether he should. By sunset, he had made up his mind. The next morning, Ethan drove into town and rented equipment. An angle grinder, safety gear, extension cords. Nothing dramatic, just practical tools for a practical job. Even so, he felt strangely nervous as he returned to the airstrip. Hank Morrison showed up halfway through the morning. The old mechanic climbed out of his truck and stared at the equipment. "You're really doing it." Ethan adjusted his gloves. "Looks that way." Hank scratched his beard. "Walter would probably hate this." "Walter's the one who left it to me." "Fair point." They worked together in silence for a while. Cutting through decades-old welds took longer than Ethan expected. Rust fought every inch. Metal screamed as the grinder bit into the seams. Dust and sparks filled the air. More than once he wondered if the effort would reveal nothing more than old junk. By early afternoon, the final weld was gone. The chains remained, but they no longer held the doors shut. Ethan stepped back. Hank stood beside him. Neither spoke. The moment felt oddly significant. 50 years. Nobody had opened those doors in 50 years. Ethan gripped one handle. Hank took the other. Together they pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then the metal groaned. Dust spilled from the seams. Slowly, inch by inch, the doors began to move. Sunlight pushed into darkness that had remained untouched since 1974. The smell hit them first. Dry air, dust, old machinery, history. They opened the doors wide enough to step inside. The hangar was larger than Ethan expected. Dust coated every surface. Workbenches lined one wall. Shelving units stood frozen in time. Several aircraft components rested beneath faded tarps. Nothing looked valuable. Nothing looked dangerous. In fact, the contents seemed strangely ordinary. Hank walked slowly through the building. I'll be damned. Ethan studied the room. If Walter had spent half a century protecting this place, why preserve a collection of obsolete airplane parts? It made no sense. Then something caught his attention near the back wall. A heavy steel toolbox sat beneath a workbench. Unlike everything else in the hangar, it appeared deliberately placed, almost hidden. Ethan walked over and brushed away the dust. The box was locked, but age had weakened the latch. It opened with a single pull. Inside were a few tools, several yellowed papers, and a small black notebook. Ethan picked it up. The cover was cracked with age. Across the front, written in faded ink, were 3 words: Jack Mercer, Flight Log. Ethan turned the black notebook over in his hands. The cover felt brittle, as if one careless movement might cause it to fall apart. Dust clung to the edges. Beside him, Hank Morrison had gone unusually quiet. The old mechanic stared at the name on the cover for several seconds before speaking. I haven't heard that name in a very long time. Ethan looked up. You know who he was. Hank nodded slowly. Jack Mercer. He sounded almost surprised by his own memory. Pilot. Flew in and out of this airstrip back when I worked here. Ethan opened the notebook carefully. The first pages contained routine flight records, dates, fuel notes, weather conditions, aircraft inspections. Nothing dramatic, yet something about the neat handwriting made Jack Mercer feel real in a way he hadn't a few minutes earlier. Not just a name, a person. Someone who had stood in this very hangar decades ago. What happened to him? Ethan asked. Hank folded his arms. Depends on who you ask. Ethan almost laughed. It was becoming a theme around Red Creek. Try me. Hank stared toward the open hangar doors. Most people said he disappeared. Disappeared. One day he was flying. Next thing anybody knew, he was gone. Ethan looked back at the notebook. Nobody found him. Not officially. The answer created more questions than it solved. By late afternoon, Ethan had carried the flight log back to the office building. He spread it across a desk beneath a working lamp he had repaired the day before. Outside, the wind rattled loose metal somewhere near the maintenance shop. Inside, he turned pages slowly. The entries covered several years. Most were routine. Short flights between small Montana towns, supply deliveries, maintenance notes. Then, gradually, the tone began to change. Several entries became unusually brief. Some dates contained only a destination and a time. A few pages appeared torn out entirely. Ethan noticed the missing sections immediately. Whoever removed them had done so carefully. Around 6 o'clock, his phone rang. Claire Morgan. Please tell me you found something interesting, she said. Ethan smiled. Maybe. 20 minutes later, she was sitting across from him in the office, studying the logbook. The local newspaper editor seemed genuinely fascinated. "Jack Mercer," she said. "I've heard that name before." "From where?" "Not sure." She frowned. "Give me a day." They spent the next hour going through the notebook together. Claire spotted details Ethan might have missed. Repeated destinations, specific dates, notes written in margins. One particular entry caught her attention. She pointed to a flight dated September 1974. "Look at this." Ethan leaned closer. The destination field had been crossed out. Someone had written over it later. "That's strange," he said. Claire nodded. "And it's one of the last entries before the record stops." Ethan turned another page, then another. The notebook ended abruptly. No final flight. No explanation. Just blank pages. "It's like somebody stopped writing in the middle of a story," Claire said. The comment stayed with Ethan long after she left. The following morning, Claire called again. This time she sounded excited. "I found him." "Found who?" "Jack Mercer." 30 minutes later, they met at the Red Creek Gazette office. Claire had already pulled several boxes from the newspaper archive room. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. She spread old newspapers across a table. Ethan immediately noticed the headlines. "Local pilot missing. Search continues. Family awaits answers." The articles were dated October 1974. Ethan read carefully. Jack Mercer had vanished during a flight. Search teams had looked for weeks. No aircraft was recovered. No wreckage was officially found. Eventually, the investigation went cold. Claire handed him another clipping. This one included a photograph. Ethan studied the image. A smiling man stood beside a small plane. Beside him were a woman and a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. "His family?" Ethan asked. Claire nodded. "Wife and daughter." Ethan looked at the picture longer than he expected. Something about it bothered him. Not the photograph itself. The idea that an entire life could simply disappear and slowly become a forgotten newspaper clipping. He thought about Emma, about how quickly years passed, about all the things people assumed they would have time to say later. Claire broke the silence. "There's something else." She slid another article across the table. Ethan read it carefully. The official report claimed Mercer had likely become disoriented during severe weather. Case closed, accident presumed. Yet one detail stood out immediately. The final flight listed in the newspaper did not match the route information Ethan had found in the logbook. "That's not the same destination." Claire nodded. "Exactly." Ethan felt a spark of excitement. So either the newspaper got it wrong, or somebody changed the record. Neither possibility was reassuring. They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing articles, photographs, and archived notes. Most led nowhere. Then, just before closing time, Ethan returned to the flight log and noticed something wedged inside the back cover. At first, he thought it was another loose page. Instead, it was a folded piece of paper hidden beneath the binding. Carefully, he pulled it free. The paper crackled with age. Claire moved closer. Together, they unfolded it on the desk. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. A hand-drawn map. Several locations were marked with circles. Most meant nothing to Ethan. One, however, stood out immediately. It was located miles from the airstrip, deep in a remote section of the valley. Beside the circle, Jack Mercer had written 2 words: "Keep safe." Ethan stared at the map for a long moment. The paper was yellowed and fragile, its edges worn from years hidden inside the flight log. The handwritten words, "Keep safe,"
seemed almost deliberate in their simplicity. Not dramatic, not mysterious, just practical. Yet something told him they mattered. Claire leaned over the desk beside him. "Do you recognize any of these locations?"
Ethan shook his head. "I've been here less than 2 weeks." Claire studied the markings. "This one might be an old service road." She pointed to a faded line crossing the valley. "And this looks like Morrison Creek. How far away? Maybe 15 miles?" Ethan folded the map carefully. "Let's find out." The next morning they left early. Claire drove because her SUV was better suited to rough roads than Ethan's aging vehicle. The Montana landscape rolled endlessly around them. Open fields gave way to hills. Hills became narrow valleys. Along the way, Claire told him more about Red Creek's history. Most of it was ordinary. Ranching, agriculture, small businesses that came and went. But every now and then she mentioned stories that never quite fit. Land disputes, property transfers, local controversies that disappeared from public discussion unusually quickly. Ethan listened carefully. "You think any of that connects to Jack Mercer?" Claire kept her eyes on the road. "I think people don't hide things for 50 years, unless they're important." By late morning, they reached the area marked on the map. At first, it seemed disappointing. There was nothing there except trees, brush, and a narrow dirt track nearly reclaimed by nature. Ethan unfolded the map again. The location matched. Maybe we're missing something. They spent nearly an hour walking through dense vegetation. More than once, Ethan wondered if they had driven all this way for nothing. Then Claire stopped. "Look at that." Half hidden beneath overgrown brush stood the remains of an old structure. Time had nearly erased it. The roof had partially collapsed. Several walls leaned at dangerous angles. From a distance, it looked like little more than a pile of weathered lumber. Up close, it was clearly an old storage shed. Ethan pushed aside a branch and stepped closer. "Think this is it? Only one way to find out." Entering the structure required caution. Parts of the floor felt unstable. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof. Dust drifted through the air. They searched slowly, examining shelves, corners, and piles of debris. Most of what remained was worthless. Rusted tools, broken crates, fragments of machinery. Then Ethan noticed something unusual near the back wall. One section of flooring looked newer than the surrounding boards. Not new exactly, just newer. He knelt and brushed away dirt. The boards had been replaced at some point. Claire crouched beside him. "You see something?" Ethan nodded. Together they pried the boards loose. Beneath them sat a metal document case. It was rectangular, about the size of a briefcase, and surprisingly well preserved. Ethan felt a surge of excitement. This can't be a coincidence. The latch resisted at first, but eventually gave way. Inside were documents, dozens of them, carefully organized despite their age. Property records, survey maps, copies of legal filings. None of it made immediate sense. Claire picked up one folder and frowned. "These are land deeds." Ethan looked closer. Several names appeared repeatedly. Families, ranch owners, parcels throughout the valley. Yet something about the paperwork seemed inconsistent. Dates didn't always match. Ownership transfers appeared unusually complicated. "Why would Jack Mercer hide land records?" Ethan asked. Claire didn't answer immediately. She continued reading. Then her expression changed. "These signatures. What about them? Some of them don't look right." Ethan sat back against a beam. The discovery raised more questions than answers. They packed the documents carefully and returned to town.
Most of the afternoon disappeared into sorting and organizing records. Claire compared names with newspaper archives, while Ethan built a rough timeline. Patterns slowly began to emerge. Several families had lost land during the early 1970s. The transfers appeared legal on paper, yet many of the supporting documents looked suspicious. Some signatures varied noticeably. Others seemed copied. "If these are forged," Ethan began. Claire finished the thought. "Then somebody stole a lot of property." The room fell silent. Suddenly, the mystery felt larger than a missing pilot. Much larger. By evening, Claire headed home with copies of several documents to research further. Ethan remained at the Airstrip office. The old building had become strangely familiar over the past week. He brewed coffee using a machine that probably should have been retired 20 years earlier, and spent another hour reviewing files. Eventually, darkness settled outside. Wind rattled the windows. Around 9 o'clock, he decided to call it a night. As he reached for the office light switch, something caught his attention. A filing cabinet drawer stood open. Ethan frowned. He was certain he had closed it earlier. He crossed the room and checked inside. Nothing appeared missing. Then he noticed another drawer, open, and another. His pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt different. He walked through the building slowly. Papers had been disturbed. Several folders sat in places he didn't remember leaving them. Whoever had entered knew exactly where to look, yet nothing valuable seemed gone. No computers, no equipment, no cash. Ethan stepped outside and scanned the dog property. The runway stretched silently into the night. Hangar 3 stood motionless beneath the stars. Whoever had been here wasn't a thief looking for money. They had been searching for something specific. And as Ethan returned to the office, he realized one folder had been moved more than any other. It contained copies of the land records he and Claire had recovered from the hidden document case. Ethan barely slept that night. Every creak in the old office building sounded suspicious. Twice he got out of bed and checked the windows. Once he walked all the way to the hangars with a flashlight. He found nothing. Yet the feeling remained. Someone had entered the office. Someone had searched through files connected to Jack Mercer and the land records hidden in the valley. By morning, the mystery no longer felt historical. It felt present. Claire arrived shortly after 9, carrying 2 coffees and a cardboard box filled with photocopies from the newspaper archive. The moment she saw Ethan's face, she set the drinks down. "You look terrible." "Thanks. Long night." Ethan showed her the disturbed filing cabinets. Claire examined the room carefully. "Nothing stolen." "Not that I can tell." "That's worse." Ethan nodded. He had reached the same conclusion. If someone wanted money, equipment, or valuables, the motive would be obvious. Searching through old land records suggested something else entirely. Claire spent the next hour comparing the recovered documents against historical property transfers. Several names appeared repeatedly. Families who had once owned large sections of valley land. Some had sold voluntarily. Others appeared to have lost property under unusual circumstances. The deeper they looked, the stranger the pattern became. Around lunchtime, Claire pushed one document toward him. "Look at this." Ethan leaned closer. The deed showed a ranch changing ownership in 1973. The signature appeared shaky, almost forced. Attached was a notarized statement claiming the owner had willingly sold. "What's wrong with it?" Ethan asked.
Claire pulled another file from the box. "Because 6 months later, this same man told a reporter he never agreed to the sale." Ethan frowned. "That should have been a huge story." "It wasn't." Why not? Claire smiled without humor.
That's becoming my favorite question. The afternoon passed in a blur of paperwork. Around 3 o'clock, Deputy Rachel Boone arrived at the airstrip. Ethan had met her briefly during the property transfer process. She was practical, direct, and not easily impressed. Claire had contacted her after the office break-in. Rachel listened carefully while Ethan explained what had happened. When he finished, she walked through the building, examining locks and windows. "No sign of forced entry," she said. "Meaning?" Ethan asked. "Meaning whoever came in probably knew how to get inside." That answer was not comforting. Before leaving, Rachel surprised them with a suggestion. "You should look into Walter Reed's personal records." Ethan glanced toward Hangar 3. "We've been doing that." "No." Rachel shook her head. "I mean his private records, not the airstrip files." "What private records?" "Most people keep backups." Ethan thought about that after she left. Walter Reed had spent decades protecting something. If the land documents were important enough to hide, why leave only one copy? The idea stayed with him through the evening. After dinner, he returned to Hangar 3, alone. The building felt different now that it was open. Less like a mystery and more like a workspace frozen in time. Dust still covered everything. Workbenches lined the walls. Shelves held forgotten tools and aircraft components. Ethan moved slowly through the hangar, flashlight in hand. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. Maybe evidence that Walter had hidden additional records. Maybe nothing at all. Near the rear wall, he stopped beside an old workbench. Something about the arrangement bothered him. One section seemed slightly newer than the rest. Not obvious, just enough to catch his attention. He crouched and examined the wooden paneling. A faint seam ran vertically behind a stack of shelves. "Come on," he muttered. After 20 minutes of moving equipment and clearing debris, the seam became easier to see. The panel wasn't part of the wall. It was a concealed compartment. His pulse quickened. He searched until he found a rusted latch hidden beneath the workbench. The mechanism resisted at first, then, with a sharp click, it released. The panel swung inward. Behind it was a narrow cavity. Inside sat a metal lockbox and several weathered envelopes bundled together with twine. Ethan carried everything to the workbench and carefully opened the first envelope. The letter inside was handwritten. The signature at the bottom stopped him cold. Walter Reed. Ethan sat down and began reading. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone. It appeared to be a personal record. Walter described conversations with Jack Mercer, concerns about certain land transactions, growing fears that powerful people were manipulating property ownership throughout the valley. Ethan opened another letter. Then another. The story became clearer with every page. Walter had not stumbled into the mystery after Jack disappeared. He had been part of the investigation from the beginning. More importantly, he had chosen to protect something after Jack vanished. Near the bottom of one letter, Ethan found a list of names. Local businessmen, attorneys, developers. Some were long dead. Others still had family in the region. The final sentence on the page made him sit perfectly still. "If anything happens to Jack, it will not be because of weather." Ethan stared at the words. Outside, the Montana wind rattled the hangar doors. Walter had believed Jack Mercer's disappearance was not an accident. That alone changed everything. But as Ethan reached for the final envelope, a folded county document slipped from between the letters and landed on the floor. Across the top, stamped in faded red ink, were words that made his heart begin to race. Investigation, File restricted access. Ethan picked up the restricted file and carried it into the office before opening it. He wasn't sure whether that was caution or respect. Something about Walter Reed's letters had changed the way he viewed the mystery. Before, it had felt like an interesting local story. Now, it felt personal. Walter had spent decades protecting records that clearly frightened someone. The old mechanic had sealed a hangar for 50 years. He had hidden letters inside a false wall, and according to his own notes, he believed Jack Mercer hadn't simply disappeared in bad weather. By sunrise, Ethan was sitting at the office desk with 3 cups of cold coffee and a growing stack of documents. The restricted county file contained only a handful of pages. Most appeared routine: search reports, flight information, weather summaries. Yet several sections had been removed. Entire pages were missing. Someone had physically cut them out years earlier. Ethan turned another page and stopped. A typed memo remained attached near the back. The date was October 21st, 1974. Subject: witness interview. Underneath, someone had stamped the word "removed" across the page. There was no witness statement attached. No explanation. Just evidence that one had existed. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "What did you see?" he muttered. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Claire stepped inside, carrying a bakery box. "You look worse than yesterday." Ethan smiled tiredly. "Good morning to you, too." 10 minutes later, they sat together reviewing Walter's letters. Claire read carefully, occasionally underlining passages in a notebook. The more they learned about Walter, the more complicated he became. He wasn't simply protecting an airstrip. He had been documenting events for years: conversations, property transfers, meetings with local officials. Several letters mentioned specific businessmen by name. Others described concerns about forged land records. "He was building a case," Claire said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Against who?" "That's the problem." She tapped one letter. "Everybody connected to this is either dead, retired, or buried beneath layers of paperwork." Ethan stared at the page. Then why is somebody still searching for these records? Neither of them had an answer. Around noon, Deputy Rachel Boone arrived. She listened carefully as Ethan explained the discovery of the hidden compartment and the restricted file. Unlike before, Rachel looked genuinely interested. She spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the documents. Then she set down the last page. "I know this file." Ethan blinked. "You do?" Rachel nodded slowly. "Not personally, but I've seen references to it." Claire leaned forward. "Where?" "County storage." Rachel folded her arms. "Years ago, there was a project to digitize old records. Most of these files were considered insignificant." "Most?" Ethan asked. Rachel hesitated. "One wasn't." The room fell silent. "Which one?" Claire asked. Rachel reached into her bag and removed a photocopy. "This is all I could find." Ethan examined the page. It was an index entry from county archives. The original file had been listed under Jack Mercer. Beside it was a handwritten note. Witness statement attached. Then another note written years later. Attachment missing. Ethan exchanged a glance with Claire. "So someone removed it?" Rachel nodded. "Looks that way." The discovery shifted the investigation once again. Somewhere there had once been a witness. Someone who saw something connected to Jack's final flight. Someone whose statement disappeared from official records. The question was why? During the afternoon, Claire returned to the newspaper archives while Ethan continued sorting Walter's papers. The work felt endless.
Yet small details kept emerging.
One letter described Walter meeting Jack 3 days before his disappearance. Another mentioned duplicate records stored separately. A third referenced the contracts. Walter never explained what contracts he meant, but the phrase appeared several times. By evening, Claire called. Her voice sounded different, excited. "I found something." 30 minutes later, Ethan met her at the newspaper office. Claire had spread several newspaper editions across a table. Most covered ordinary local news. Then she pointed to a small article buried near the back of a 1974 issue. "Look at this." Ethan read quickly. The article described a community meeting about disputed land ownership in the valley. Several ranch families had challenged recent property transfers. Nothing unusual there. But one sentence caught his attention. A local pilot had reportedly offered to provide supporting documentation. "Jack Mercer." Claire nodded. "The timing matches perfectly." Ethan stared at the page. Jack wasn't just transporting documents. He was actively involved. The pilot had intended to present evidence. Evidence connected to the land disputes. Claire slid another clipping across the table. This one contained a photograph of the meeting. Most faces meant nothing to Ethan. One did. He recognized him from Walter's letters. A local businessman repeatedly mentioned alongside suspicious property deals. The same man appeared standing beside county officials. "Walter was right," Ethan said quietly. Claire looked at him. "About what?" Ethan tapped the photograph. This wasn't random. As they continued reviewing files, Claire suddenly froze. "Wait." She pulled another document from a folder and compared it to the photograph. "What?" Ethan asked. Claire looked up. "I know where the missing witness statement might have gone." Ethan stared at her. "How?" "Because the witness wasn't just anyone." She pointed at a name scribbled in the margin of an archived note. The witness was a county employee. So, Claire swallowed. So county employees had personnel records, retirement files, storage boxes. Ethan felt a surge of hope. "You think it still exists?" Claire nodded slowly. "Maybe." Before Ethan could respond, Rachel's name flashed across his phone screen. He answered immediately. Her voice was urgent. "Ethan, listen carefully." His stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" There was a brief pause. Then Rachel said the one thing he hadn't expected. "I found the original witness file, and somebody tried to access it this morning." Ethan and Claire were already driving toward the county records building before Rachel finished explaining the situation. The evening sky over Red Creek had turned gray, and the first signs of rain were moving across the valley. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. The mystery had changed again. What began as a sealed hangar and a missing pilot had become something larger, something that still seemed important enough for people to keep searching decades later. Rachel met them at a side entrance. She carried a file box tucked under one arm. "I didn't want to discuss this over the phone," she said. "Probably a good decision," Claire replied. Rachel led them into a small records room tucked behind the main county offices. Metal shelving lined the walls. Most boxes were coated in dust. She placed the file box on a table. "This was buried in personnel archives." Ethan stared at the label. The name printed on the folder was Harold Bennett. "The witness?" Rachel nodded. "County surveyor, retired in 1982. Died 15 years ago." Claire sat down immediately and opened the folder. Inside were employment records, retirement forms, and several handwritten notes. Most were routine.
Then, Ethan found a thin envelope clipped near the back. The seal had already been broken years ago. He carefully removed a folded document. Across the top were the words, "Witness Statement." For a moment, nobody spoke. They had finally found what had been missing from the investigation file. Ethan began reading aloud. Harold Bennett had been driving along a ridge road on the night Jack Mercer disappeared. Severe weather had moved through the valley. Visibility was poor. At approximately 8:40 p.m., he observed a low-flying aircraft traveling east toward the mountains. Nothing unusual there. Then the statement became more interesting. Bennett reported seeing a second vehicle parked near an isolated section of land several miles from the official flight path. He described headlights, multiple individuals, and what appeared to be signal lights aimed toward the sky. Ethan looked up. Signal lights? Rachel nodded. Keep reading. Bennett wrote that the aircraft changed direction shortly after passing the location. Minutes later, it vanished into storm clouds. The witness never claimed the lights caused the crash, but he clearly believed they were connected. Claire leaned back in her chair. That was removed from the investigation. Apparently, Rachel said. Ethan continued reading. The final page contained a handwritten addition made several days later. Bennett claimed he was approached by unidentified individuals and advised to stop discussing what he had seen. No names were listed, no accusations, just a note. Yet it changed everything. Jack's final flight may not have followed the route reported in official records because he had been heading somewhere specific. Somewhere connected to the land documents. Claire studied the statement again. Do we know where this ridge road was? Rachel pointed to a county map hanging on the wall. Actually, we do. The location sat near the eastern edge of the valley, close to rugged terrain that few people visited anymore. Ethan recognized it immediately. It wasn't far from one of the marked locations on Jack Mercer's map. The same map hidden inside the flight log. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. More and more pieces were beginning to align. The land records, the forged deeds, Walter's letters, the missing witness statement. None of it felt random anymore. As darkness fell outside, they returned to the airstrip and spread everything across the office desk. Ethan compared the witness statement to Jack's hand-drawn map. Claire reviewed property transfers. Rachel examined county records. For hours, they worked quietly. Eventually, Claire stopped and pointed to a location circled on the map. This is it. Ethan looked closer. What? The area Bennett described. She tapped the paper again. Jack marked it. Rachel leaned forward. You think he went there before he disappeared? I think he was supposed to. Ethan studied the map. One detail suddenly stood out. The marked location sat near a narrow canyon and an abandoned mining road. Remote, difficult to reach, easy to overlook. Exactly the kind of place someone might use to hide something. Walter's letters mentioned duplicate records. The shed had contained one collection of documents. But what if it wasn't the only hiding place? The possibility hung in the air. Around midnight, they finally stepped outside for fresh air. Wind moved across the runway. Hangar 3 stood illuminated by a single floodlight. Ethan looked toward the mountains in the distance. A week earlier, he had been worried about overdue bills and finding another consulting contract. Now he was standing in the middle of a decades-old mystery that seemed to grow larger every day. Claire followed his gaze. You okay? Ethan smiled slightly. Just thinking. About Jack? About Walter. Rachel nodded. He spent 50 years protecting this.
Ethan looked toward the hangar, which means he thought it mattered. Nobody argued. Before leaving, Rachel handed him a photocopy of the witness statement. A note had been written in the margin years earlier, almost hidden beneath another page. Ethan nearly missed it. Then he read the words and felt a chill run through him. The note wasn't written by Harold Bennett. It was written by an investigator. Search area incomplete. Possible evidence not recovered. Ethan looked up. What evidence? Rachel shook her head. No idea. Claire stared at the map spread across the hood of her SUV. Then her eyes widened slightly. Maybe we do. Ethan followed her gaze. Her finger rested on a point deep inside the mountains beyond the canyon, a place no search team had ever officially examined, and according to Jack Mercer's map, it was the last location he had marked before he vanished. The next morning began before sunrise. Ethan stood beside Claire's SUV, holding a thermos of coffee, while Rachel checked equipment for the third time. None of them said much. The map lay spread across the hood of the vehicle, illuminated by a flashlight. The marked location sat deep in a section of rugged terrain that most people avoided. There were no maintained roads, no buildings, and no reason for anyone to visit unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. Ethan folded the map and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Let's go. The drive took nearly an hour. The hike took even longer. The canyon walls grew steeper as they moved deeper into the mountains. Fallen trees blocked sections of the old mining road. Loose rock made every step uncertain. More than once, Ethan wondered whether they had misread the clues entirely. The location on Jack Mercer's map could have meant anything. A landmark, a meeting place, a memory. It didn't necessarily mean evidence still existed. Yet every clue had pointed them here. By late morning, they reached the area marked on the map. The place looked unremarkable. A narrow clearing sat between rocky slopes. Pine trees crowded the edges. Wind moved through the branches overhead. Claire slowly turned in a circle. This is it. Ethan checked the map again. This is it. Rachel surveyed the terrain. If something was hidden here 50 years ago, nature's had plenty of time to cover it. The search began methodically. They divided the clearing into sections and moved slowly. Ethan checked rock formations. Claire examined old tree lines. Rachel looked for signs of disturbed ground. Hours passed. The excitement that had carried them into the mountains gradually gave way to frustration. By early afternoon, they had found nothing. Ethan sat on a boulder and stared at the map again. He thought about Walter Reed, about the years he spent protecting records, about Jack Mercer risking everything to preserve evidence. It seemed impossible that the trail would simply end here. Claire approached carrying a bottle of water. You look disappointed. Ethan smiled faintly. I was hoping for something obvious. Nothing about this has been obvious. She sat beside him. For a few moments, they watched the wind move across the canyon. Then Ethan's attention shifted to a line drawn near the edge of the map. One detail suddenly bothered him. The marked location wasn't centered on the clearing. It pointed toward a ridge above it. He stood up immediately. What is it? Claire asked. Ethan unfolded the map. We've been searching the wrong place. 20 minutes later, they were climbing the ridge. The terrain became more difficult with every step. Loose gravel slid beneath their boots. Several times, they had to use their hands to pull themselves upward. Finally, they reached a narrow shelf overlooking the valley below. Rachel stopped first. Hold on. She pointed toward a cluster of rocks near the edge of the ridge. At first, Ethan saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the shape. A section of stone had collapsed inward, exposing something beneath. They hurried closer. Half buried beneath dirt and rock sat a rusted metal box. Ethan's heart began to race. The lock had long since corroded away. Together they cleared away debris and lifted the lid. Inside were waterproof packets wrapped in oilcloth. Remarkably, most had survived. Claire carefully opened the first bundle. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God!" Ethan looked over her shoulder. The documents inside were original property contracts, not copies. Originals, signatures, survey maps, legal records, everything needed to prove ownership histories throughout the valley. Rachel opened another packet. It contained sworn statements, witness testimonies, letters. Names they recognized from Walter's records appeared throughout the files. The pattern became obvious almost immediately. Several land transfers had been fraudulent. Families had been pressured, deceived, or manipulated into losing property. Some signatures appeared forged. Others were supported by false documentation. Ethan sat back against the rocks and stared at the evidence. After all these years, it had survived, not because of luck, because someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve it. Claire opened one final envelope. A folded letter slid out. The handwriting matched Jack Mercer's flight log. Ethan unfolded it carefully. The letter was addressed to whoever eventually found the records. Jack explained that he had uncovered evidence of organized land fraud affecting multiple families across the valley. He planned to deliver the documents publicly, but he feared the records would disappear if he carried everything with him. So he created duplicates. He hid them. He trusted Walter Reed to protect the truth if anything happened. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. The missing pilot hadn't abandoned his family. He hadn't vanished voluntarily. He had been trying to expose something. Rachel continued sorting through the evidence. Then she suddenly stopped. "This is it." Ethan looked up. She held a contract in one hand and a sworn testimony in the other. Together, they connected the same individuals identified throughout Walter's letters. The final link, the proof tying the fraudulent land transfers to specific people and actions. The room for doubt vanished. Claire slowly exhaled. "This connects everything." Ethan nodded. For several moments, none of them spoke. The mystery that began inside a sealed hangar had finally reached its center. Yet as Ethan looked across the mountains, he realized one final step remained. Finding the truth was not the same as proving it. The evidence still needed verification. The records still needed to be examined, and most importantly, the story of Jack Mercer still needed to be told. As they carefully packed the lockbox and documents for the trip back to Red Creek, Ethan unfolded Jack's letter one final time. At the bottom, beneath the signature, was a short handwritten note added separately. 4 words. A message apparently intended for Walter. "If you're reading this..." Ethan turned the page over. The final sentence continued on the back. "Protect the truth until someone else can finish the job." The trip back to Red Creek felt different. The lockbox rested in the rear of Claire's SUV, surrounded by copies of documents, witness statements, contracts, and letters that had survived storms, decades, and deliberate attempts to bury them. Ethan spent most of the drive looking out the window. The mountains gradually gave way to open ranch land. Fields stretched beneath a bright Montana sky. A week earlier, he would have driven through the same landscape thinking about overdue bills and job applications. Now he was carrying evidence that could finally explain what happened to Jack Mercer and why Walter Reed had protected a sealed hangar for half a century. The next several weeks passed in a blur. Rachel coordinated with state investigators.
Attorneys reviewed the contracts. Historians examined the records. Every document had to be verified. Every claim had to be supported. The process moved slowly, but the evidence proved remarkably consistent. Original deeds matched survey records. Witness statements aligned with financial transactions. The same names appeared again and again. Families throughout the valley had lost land through fraudulent transfers hidden beneath layers of paperwork. Some cases were too old to reverse legally. Others were not. The truth that Jack Mercer had tried to protect was finally becoming impossible to ignore. Claire's newspaper became the first to publish the story. The headline covered nearly half the front page. Ethan stood in the Gazette office holding a copy while Claire watched nervously. "Well?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "I think Walter would have approved." The article spread quickly. Larger newspapers picked it up. Regional television stations arrived. Reporters began contacting families whose names appeared in the recovered documents. For many of them, the story reopened wounds that had never completely healed. Yet it also brought something unexpected: validation. People who had spent decades believing nobody cared suddenly learned that someone had cared enough to preserve the evidence. Someone had spent 50 years waiting for the truth to be found. One afternoon, Ethan attended a public hearing at the county courthouse. The room was full. Some people stood along the walls because every seat had been taken. Investigators presented their findings. Historians explained the significance of the recovered records. Several descendants of affected families spoke about losses passed from one generation to the next. Ethan listened quietly from the back row. Then the discussion shifted to Jack Mercer. An investigator summarized the final conclusions. The missing pilot had not abandoned his family. The evidence showed he had been gathering documentation connected to the fraudulent land transactions. He had created duplicate records and distributed them to trusted individuals, including Walter Reed. During a severe storm in October 1974, his aircraft crashed in remote terrain while he was attempting to transport additional evidence. The crash itself was likely accidental, but the records surrounding the case had later been manipulated, and crucial witness information had been removed from official files. The room fell silent when the investigator finished. For 50 years, people had speculated about Jack Mercer. Some believed he disappeared voluntarily. Others assumed he had run away. Now the truth finally stood in the open. Ethan thought about the photograph he had found in the newspaper archive. Jack standing beside his wife and young daughter. A life interrupted. A reputation slowly erased, then finally restored. After the hearing, a woman approached Ethan. She looked to be in her late 50s. "You're Ethan Walker?" she asked. "Yes." Her eyes drifted toward the courthouse. "My father was Jack Mercer." Ethan froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled softly. "Thank you." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "I didn't do this alone." "Maybe not." She glanced toward the mountains visible through the courthouse windows. But somebody had to keep looking. Several months later, the airstrip looked different. Not new, not polished, but alive. Volunteers had helped repair sections of fencing. Local aviation enthusiasts donated equipment and historical displays. The office building received a fresh coat of paint. The runway was inspected and approved for limited community use. Ethan found himself working harder than he had in years. Strangely, he enjoyed it. The project gave structure to his days, purpose to his decisions, a future he hadn't expected to find. One evening near the end of summer,
He stood beside Hangar 3 while workers installed a bronze plaque near the entrance. Claire arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this." Ethan accepted one. Together they watched the final bolts being tightened into place. The plaque contained a short inscription. "Some people protect the truth long enough for someone else to find it." Ethan read the words several times. Walter Reed had never sought recognition. Neither had Jack Mercer. Yet their actions had changed lives long after they were gone. As sunset settled across the valley, a small training aircraft approached the runway. Ethan watched it descend smoothly toward the pavement. The wheels touched down. The plane rolled to a stop. For a moment, he simply stood there listening to the fading engine noise. Claire smiled. "Looks good, doesn't it?" Ethan nodded. It did. Not because the mystery was solved, not because the headlines had faded, but because the place no longer felt abandoned. Neither did he. He thought about the day he received the attorney's phone call, about the unemployment, the uncertainty, and the feeling that everything important had already happened in his life. He had arrived in Montana believing he was inheriting a worthless airstrip. Instead, he inherited a responsibility, a story, a second chance. The evening light reflected off the hangar doors as Ethan looked across the runway one last time. For years he had measured his life by everything he had lost. Now, standing beside the hangar nobody had opened since 1974, he found himself thinking about something else entirely. What he had chosen to build.